The wind in Isdalen moved like a hand through hair, cold and patient, carrying the smell of peat and old snow. Dawn had not yet broken when a hiker found the body tucked against a slope of rock and scrub, a figure half hidden in the valley's hush. The discovery would ripple through Bergen and then the world. A woman, unidentified, found dead in Isdalen on November 29, 1970. The valley's name, Isdalen, the Ice Valley, would become shorthand for a case that refused to settle into explanation. The morgue photographs were clinical and unkind. The woman's face, preserved in black and white, became the face of a question. She was estimated to be between 25 and 40 years old, of medium height, with no identification and no name to anchor her story. The official cause of death recorded a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning and a barbiturate overdose, a verdict that read like a closed book but left pages torn out and scattered on the wind. The police at the time leaned toward suicide, but the evidence resisted that tidy conclusion and invited suspicion instead. Small, deliberate erasures marked the scene. Labels had been cut from clothing. Tags and identifying marks were removed as if someone had tried to scrub the woman of provenance. Her luggage and possessions suggested travel and preparation. Multiple sets of clothing, false labels, and a collection of items that hinted at deliberate concealment. Witnesses later described seeing a woman matching her description in Bergen hotels and on trains, using different names and different accents. A life of shifting identities that read like a spy novel and smelled of secrets. The watch on her wrist had been altered. The labels on garments were gone. The language of the case became one of absence. Investigators cataloged the missing and the strange. Burned clothing, coded notes, and a trail of small, contradictory clues that refused to point to a single author. For decades, the Isdal Woman remained a cipher, a person reduced to fragments and forensic notes, a life that could not be stitched back together from the evidence left behind. Half a century later, the case still drew attention, new theories, and renewed probes. Journalists, amateur sleuths, and cold case teams returned to the valley and to the archives, re-examining photographs, witness statements, and the few physical traces that remained. Periodic waves of reporting and fresh inquiries, including renewed interest and updates in recent years, kept the mystery alive and the questions current. Who was she? Why was she traveling under multiple identities? And was her death truly suicide or something far darker? The morning the body was found, local police moved into the valley with the careful, methodical air of people trained to turn disorder into record. They logged the scene, collected burned clothing, and noted that labels had been removed from garments. A detail that would haunt the investigation because it suggested deliberate concealment rather than random decay. The official file recorded the cause of death as a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning and a barbiturate overdose, a medical conclusion that sat uneasily beside the physical evidence and the missing identifiers. Detectives interviewed hikers, hotel clerks, and anyone who might have seen a woman matching the description. A handful of witnesses later described a woman who moved through Bergen with practiced anonymity. Different names, different accents, and a pattern of short stays in cheap hotels. These accounts painted a portrait of someone who knew how to travel without leaving a trace, and they forced investigators to treat the case not as a simple death, but as a puzzle of identity. The police cataloged receipts, train timetables, and hotel registers, trying to stitch together a timeline from the thin threads available. One early witness, a child on a Sunday walk, would later be remembered for the bluntness of her discovery. She saw something that did not belong in the quiet slope of Isdalen and told her family. That sighting set the official response in motion and anchored the case to a precise place and time, even as the woman herself remained unanchored by name or origin. The valley's isolation meant the first responders had to work quickly to preserve what little evidence remained from the elements and from human interference. Forensics in 1970 had limits, but the investigators used what they had. They photographed the scene, took samples, and preserved clothing and personal effects that might later yield clues. Among the items were bottles, a partially burned map, and scraps of paper with cryptic notations. The removal of labels from clothing and the presence of multiple sets of garments suggested someone had planned for mobility and obfuscation. It also raised the possibility that others had assisted in erasing identity, whether before or after death. As the days turned into weeks, the case took on a public life. Newspapers ran photographs and speculative headlines. The police faced pressure to explain a death that seemed to resist explanation. Investigators balanced routine police work, canvassing, cross-checking hotel logs, and comparing dental records, with the growing sense that this was not an ordinary suicide. Small inconsistencies in witness statements, the altered watch, and the absence of identification kept the inquiry open-ended and uneasy. By the time the initial report closed, the Isdal Woman had become a dossier of absences. Names scratched away, labels cut out, and a life reduced to objects and fragments. The investigators left behind a paper trail that would later be combed over by journalists and amateur sleuths. But in those first weeks, it was the police who carried the burden of unanswered questions, aware that every lead they chased might dissolve into the same cold fog that hung over the valley. The city moved in its ordinary rhythms while the investigators tried to map a life that had left almost no trace. Bergen's train station and its cluster of small hotels became the first real terrain of the inquiry. Places where a stranger might leave a pattern, a name, a receipt. Detectives traced the Isdal Woman's last known movements through timetables and ledger books, following the faint, bureaucratic footprints of a traveler who had been careful to leave as little as possible. Hotel clerks remembered a woman who paid in cash and stayed only a night or two. She used different names, sometimes a Scandinavian-sounding alias, sometimes a foreign one, and she spoke with accents that shifted like the weather. The registers offered fragments, a signature that might be a name, a room number, or a date. Investigators copied each entry, then compared handwriting, ink, and the cadence of signatures, searching for a thread that could tie the woman to a single identity. The handwriting yielded nothing decisive, only the sense of someone practiced at appearing ordinary. At the station, ticket stubs and timetables suggested a route. Trains to and from Bergen, short hops between towns, a pattern of movement that favored anonymity. Witnesses described a woman with a heavy coat and a purposeful gait, carrying small suitcases and a careful silence. She avoided lingering in public spaces, preferring the liminal places of travel, waiting rooms, platform edges, the shadowed corners of cafes where conversations blurred into the background. For the detectives, those liminal places were both promising and maddening, full of potential witnesses, but also full of people who might not remember what they had seen. Customs and passport checks offered little. The woman's documents, when found among her effects, were inconsistent. Different names, different stamps, and some papers that could not be traced to any issuing authority. Investigators sent what they could to national and international agencies, hoping that fingerprints, dental records, or passport numbers would produce a match. The fingerprints returned no immediate hits. Dental comparisons were inconclusive. Each negative result tightened the case's grip on the mystery rather than loosening it. Hotel staff recalled small details that later took on weight. The woman's preference for tea at odd hours, a habit of writing in a small notebook, the way she folded her clothes with meticulous care. One clerk remembered a conversation about mountains and solitude. Another remembered a laugh that did not match the seriousness of her face. These human fragments were the opposite of the clinical evidence in the morgue, messy, subjective, and alive with contradiction. Detectives recorded them all, aware that memory could be both a tool and a trap. Rumors began to circulate in the city. Whispers of espionage, of clandestine meetings in the harbor, of a woman who might have been more than she appeared. The press seized on the most sensational possibilities, and the police found themselves navigating not only leads but also public imagination. Investigators had to separate gossip from testimony, to weigh the reliability of each recollection against the physical record. By the end of the chapter on hotel registers and station logs, the picture remained partial. The Isdal Woman had moved through Bergen like a shadow passing through light, visible in outline, impossible to hold. The detectives compiled lists, cross-checked names, and sent inquiries abroad. Each action, a small attempt to stitch together a life from the thin fabric of travel documents and human memory. The city kept its ordinary pace, unaware that its ordinary places had become the stage for a mystery that would not let go. The autopsy room smelled of antiseptic and the low hum of fluorescent lights. For the investigators, the body was no longer a mystery in the abstract, but a ledger of physical facts that might be read like a language. The pathologist worked with the steady, unromantic patience of someone who translates the body into evidence. Measurements, samples, photographs, and a list of anomalies that refuse to fit a single neat explanation. The cause of death was recorded as a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning and a barbiturate overdose. The lungs showed signs consistent with inhalation of combustion byproducts, and toxicology revealed sedatives at levels that could have incapacitated a person. Yet the presence of both elements, a gas that suffocates and a drug that dulls, created attention in the report. Was this a suicide staged to look like an accident compounded by self-medication, or something more deliberate and sinister? The pathologist's notes were precise but not definitive. They offered mechanisms without motive. Physical clues on the body and clothing deepened the unease. Several garments had been partially burned and then extinguished, as if someone had tried to destroy them and then stopped. Labels had been cut from shirts and coats, seams were trimmed, and the stitching on some items had been altered. The watch on her wrist had been tampered with, its back removed and the strap shortened. Small, deliberate erasures suggested a person who either wanted to disappear or someone else who wanted to ensure she could not be traced. The hair and skin were examined for foreign substances. Traces of soot and carbon were present, consistent with exposure to smoke, but some residues puzzled the lab technicians. Faint chemical traces that did not match routine household products. Samples were sent to specialized labs, and the waiting for results stretched the investigation into a new kind of suspense. Each test that returned negative narrowed possibilities, but also sharpened the sense that the case was being pushed away from ordinary explanations. Dental records and fingerprints were compared against national databases. The teeth offered a map of life. Dental work that suggested travel, a mix of fillings and crowns that hinted at care in different countries. Fingerprints produced no match in the national system, and the absence of a record became another absence to catalog. Investigators photographed scars and marks. A healed fracture on a rib, a faint tattoo that had been partially removed, and a small scar behind an ear. These were personal traces, intimate and stubborn, resisting the erasure that had been attempted on her clothing. The partially burned map found among her effects was scrutinized under magnification. Burn patterns suggested it had been set alight in a small, controlled way. The edges curled but did not disintegrate. Notes in a small notebook were photographed and transcribed. Some entries were dates, others fragments of place names and times. Handwriting analysis could not conclusively link the script to any known sample, but the rhythm of the letters suggested someone educated and practiced in concealment. For the detectives, the autopsy yielded both answers and new questions. The body spoke in the blunt, literal terms of pathology, but the human story, who she had been, why she had been traveling under multiple names, and whether her death was self-inflicted or the result of foul play, remained stubbornly out of reach. The physical evidence had been preserved, catalogued, and filed, ready for future re-examination. In the meantime, the valley kept its silence, and the woman's body, now a set of clinical notes and boxed samples, became the central, immovable fact around which speculation and sorrow would orbit. The Isdal Woman's trail frayed outward from Bergen like a set of tentative compass points, each one suggesting a life that had crossed borders and bureaucracies. Investigators followed the paper traces, passports, stamps, and hotel receipts, and found a pattern of deliberate inconsistency. Documents bore different names, mismatched stamps, and travel routes that looped through ports and border towns, as if someone had learned to move where oversight thinned and questions softened. Those patterns invited a darker vocabulary: espionage, courier work, or a life lived in service of secrets. Rumors hardened into leads when foreign agencies were contacted. The Norwegian police sent inquiries abroad, and the case brushed against the edges of international systems. Passport offices, consulates, and the slow machinery of Interpol. Responses were uneven. Some agencies replied with helpful dead ends. Others offered silence or bureaucratic deflection. The woman's dental work and certain items among her effects suggested care in multiple countries, and that suggestion pushed investigators to consider that she might have been part of a network that moved people and information across borders with practiced ease. In Bergen, the idea of espionage fit the era's anxieties. The Cold War's shadow made clandestine activity plausible and lent ordinary objects a charged meaning. A map with burned edges could be a route. A notebook of place names could be a log of contacts. Journalists and gossipmongers filled the gaps with speculation about secret meetings in harbors and coded exchanges in cafes. Detectives, trained to separate imagination from evidence, nonetheless had to reckon with the possibility that the woman's anonymity was not merely personal but professional, a tool of trade for someone who needed to be untraceable. Witnesses who had seen her in hotels and on trains described behaviors that read like tradecraft. Paying in cash, avoiding registration under a consistent name, and traveling light with carefully folded clothes. A few recalled overheard phrases that sounded rehearsed. Others remembered the woman's habit of watching exits more than people. These small observations did not prove espionage, but they fit a pattern that made the hypothesis difficult to dismiss. For the detectives, the question became not only who she was, but what she was doing and for whom. At the same time, alternative explanations persisted. She might have been a private person with reasons to hide from a past, a courier for smugglers, or someone fleeing personal danger. The same behaviors that suggested intelligence work could also be explained by fear, shame, or survival. The investigators cataloged each possibility without privileging any single narrative, aware that motive and method could be separate things. International leads produced one tantalizing but inconclusive thread, a series of passport numbers and stamps that matched no single issuing authority. Some documents appeared to be genuine but altered. Others were forgeries of a kind that suggested access to skilled counterfeiters. The presence of such papers raised the stakes. If she had been traveling on false documents, then whoever had supplied them had resources and intent. That possibility widened the circle of inquiry from a solitary death in a valley to a network that might span ports, embassies, and shadowed rooms. By the end of the chapter, the case had become a map of possibilities rather than a map of facts. Each international lead opened new directions and closed others, leaving the Isdal woman's life to hover between the plausible and the fantastical. The valley remained the only place where her body had been found, but the evidence suggested a life that had been lived elsewhere, in languages and systems that resisted easy translation. The mystery had grown outward, and with it the sense that the truth, if it existed, would require patience, persistence, and the slow unspooling of threads that crossed borders in time. Newsprint smelled of ink and urgency as Bergen's papers turned the Isdal woman into a public question. Photographs from the morgue, grainy and stark, ran beneath headlines that demanded answers. The city's curiosity sharpened into appetite. Strangers read the same paragraphs and felt the same small, private shiver at the idea of an anonymous death in a familiar valley. Reporters arrived with notebooks and a hunger for narrative, and the case began to live in two registers at once. The slow, methodical work of police and the quick, hungry logic of headlines. Journalists chased leads with the zeal of those who know that a good story can outpace facts. Some pieces leaned towards sober reconstruction, cataloging hotel registers and witness statements. Others favored speculation, stitching together the most sensational possibilities into tidy, clickable arcs. Espionage sold papers. So did romance and tragedy. The Isdal woman's image, her face reduced to a single photograph, became a canvas onto which readers projected motives and meanings. Letters to the editor arrived with theories, accusations, and pleas for closure. The public conversation turned the unknown woman into a mirror for communal anxieties. The press's attention had practical consequences. Witnesses who might otherwise have stayed silent came forward, some with useful recollections, others with embellished memories shaped by what they had read. Hotel clerks and train attendants were suddenly aware that their casual impressions might be scrutinized in print. Detectives found themselves managing not only evidence but also narrative, correcting errors, quelling rumors, and sometimes watching as their careful work was reframed into simpler, more dramatic stories. The police press office learned to speak in measured statements, aware that every phrase could be amplified. At the same time, the media's appetite created pressure for quick answers. Editors wanted a resolution, readers wanted a name, That pressure pushed investigators to prioritize leads and to release information that might otherwise have remained internal. In some cases, premature disclosures complicated the inquiry. Witnesses altered their accounts after reading reports, and false leads multiplied. The city's gossip network, fed by newspapers and cafes, became another layer of investigation, one that was noisy and unreliable, but impossible to ignore. Public fascination also produced unexpected acts of empathy. Strangers left flowers at the valley's edge. A few people organized vigils, not because they knew the woman, but because the image of an unnamed life felt like an affront to communal decency. The Isdal Woman became, paradoxically, both anonymous and intimate, a symbol of vulnerability that drew people together even as it exposed the limits of what a community could know about a single life. Over time, the media cycle shifted. New stories replaced old ones. The city's attention moved on and then returned in waves. Each resurgence brought fresh interviews, renewed speculation, and sometimes new evidence unearthed by persistent reporters. Decades later, as interest revived in different eras, journalists would comb archives and re-interview witnesses, finding details missed or misinterpreted the first time. The press had not solved the case, but it had kept the question alive, ensuring that the Isdal Woman's story would not be buried with the valley's snow. The chapter closed on a city that had been both stage and audience. Bergen had watched, written, and argued, and in doing so had shaped the contours of the mystery. The public's voice had become part of the record, a chorus of curiosity and compassion that complicated the investigator's task and deepened the case's human resonance. Decades folded over the Isdal Woman like layers of sediment, each year burying questions and preserving fragments. What had once been routine police work became, in later years, a different kind of labor, the patient, methodical business of cold case investigation. New teams reopened boxes, reread reports, and treated the old files not as closed chapters but as raw material for fresh inquiry. The valley's silence had not changed, but the tools available to listen had. Advances in forensic science reframed the evidence. Techniques that were unavailable in 1970, improved toxicology, more sensitive chemical assays, and later DNA analysis, offered the possibility of extracting new information from preserved samples. Investigators who returned to the case did so with a different vocabulary: mitochondrial DNA, isotope analysis, and digital reconstruction. Where earlier detectives had relied on paper trails and witness memory, modern teams could interrogate fibers, residues, and genetic traces with a precision that once belonged to the realm of imagination. Archivists and cold case detectives worked together to inventory what remained: clothing in sealed bags, photographs, notebooks, and the small, burned map. Each item was rephotographed, recatalogued, and retested where possible. Laboratories re-examined soot and chemical residues with techniques that could detect compounds at parts per billion levels. Hair and bone samples, when available, were analyzed for isotopic signatures that could suggest geographic origins based on diet and water sources. These scientific threads did not promise instant answers, but they offered new ways to narrow possibilities and to challenge assumptions made in the first wave of inquiry. DNA, when it became usable, changed the tenor of the investigation. Even degraded samples could sometimes yield mitochondrial profiles that, while not uniquely identifying, could be compared against databases and living relatives. The possibility of matching a genetic signature to a family tree opened doors that had been closed for decades. At the same time, the limits of degraded material and the ethical complexities of modern genetic sleuthing required careful handling. Consent, privacy, and the risk of false leads had to be balanced against the hope of identification. Public interest, rekindled by documentaries and investigative journalism, played a catalytic role in the revival. New witnesses came forward, sometimes with memories sharpened by time, sometimes with details that contradicted earlier accounts. Amateur sleuths and online communities sifted through digitized archives, cross-referencing names and travel routes, and occasionally turning up overlooked documents. Professional investigators had to navigate this noisy landscape, using public energy as a resource while guarding against misinformation and confirmation bias. Re-examination also revealed procedural gaps from the original inquiry. Lost notes, untested samples, and interviews that had not been recorded. Modern teams reconstructed timelines with the benefit of hindsight, identifying where early assumptions might have closed off lines of inquiry. In some cases, reanalysis corrected errors. In others, it deepened the mystery by showing how much had been irretrievably altered by time and human intervention. By the chapter's end, the cold case revival had not produced a neat resolution, but had transformed the investigation into a layered, collaborative effort between science, journalism, and public curiosity. The Isdal Woman remained unnamed, but the methods of discovery had multiplied. The valley still held its secret, yet the world had grown more capable of listening, and more determined to keep listening, until the fragments finally yielded a coherent voice. Years after the valley closed its first chapter, a new cast of investigators gathered around the old files. A forensic scientist with a taste for isotope puzzles, a dogged cold case detective who refused to accept tidy endings, a journalist who treated archives like treasure maps, and an online community that turned curiosity into method. Each brought a theory and a temperament, and together they turned the Isdal Woman from a single unsolved death into a field of competing explanations, each plausible in its own register. Espionage remained the most seductive narrative. For some investigators, the pattern of false names, altered clothing, and burned papers fit the Cold War's grammar. Couriers, handlers, and safe houses. The journalist championing this line dug into travel routes and passport anomalies, finding gaps where official records should have been. He argued that the woman's meticulous erasures were not the work of a private person trying to hide shame, but of someone trained to be untraceable. His articles framed the valley as a place where international secrets could end in quiet violence, and his interviews with retired intelligence officers added a speculative authority that the public found irresistible. Opposing that view were those who saw a private life of fear and escape. A cold case detective, shaped by decades of domestic investigations, emphasized patterns of flight rather than tradecraft, cash payments, short hotel stays, and a habit of avoiding long-term ties. She argued that the same behaviors could belong to someone fleeing abuse, debt, or a dangerous relationship. Her champions were social workers and family search volunteers who focused on missing person reports and the human reasons people erase themselves. For them, the Isdal Woman was not a cipher of geopolitics, but a person whose anonymity was a survival strategy. A third camp leaned on forensic science to reframe the debate. The forensic chemist who retested residues and the genealogist who ran degraded DNA through modern databases offered a different kind of authority: numbers and matches. Isotope analysis suggested regions where the woman might have spent formative years. Dental patterns hinted at care in multiple countries. These findings did not produce a name, but they narrowed possibilities and undercut some earlier assumptions. The scientists' careful caveats about contamination, degraded samples, and statistical limits tempered the more dramatic claims, but they also gave the investigation a new, patient momentum. Online sleuths and amateur historians formed a fourth force. They cross-referenced hotel registers, digitized newspapers, and passenger lists, turning collective curiosity into crowdsourced research. Their work produced leads that professional investigators sometimes followed, and it produced noise that sometimes misled. A charismatic podcaster amplified both the best and the worst of this movement, turning obscure archival details into serialist drama and drawing new attention and new pressure onto the case. These competing perspectives created friction and collaboration in equal measure. Meetings between scientists and journalists could be tense. One side demanded narrative clarity, the other insisted on methodological caution. Yet the friction produced progress. A genealogist's tentative mitochondrial match, when combined with a detective's overlooked hotel receipt and a journalist's archival find, created a composite lead that none of them could have produced alone. By the chapter's end, no single theory had triumphed. Instead, the case had become a mosaic of plausible lives. A woman who might have been a courier, a refugee from a private danger, or someone whose past simply refused to be captured by the records that survived. The champions of each theory continued their work with different languages, documents, DNA, interviews, and online threads, but all shared a common conviction. that the Isdal woman deserved more than speculation. She deserved a name, and they would keep pushing until the fragments yielded it. Years of patient sifting finally yielded a thread that felt less like rumor and more like traction. A small laboratory, working with degraded mitochondrial DNA from a hair sample preserved in the case file, produced a partial profile that matched a cluster of living descendants in a European genealogy database. The match was not a full identification but a bridge, a likely maternal lineage that narrowed the field from continents to a handful of regions and, crucially, suggested living relatives who might hold the missing pieces. For the team that had kept the case alive, the result was electric, an empirical foothold after decades of speculation. The discovery set off a chain reaction. Detectives reached out to the genealogist who had run the comparison, then to the living relatives identified through public records and careful outreach. Conversations were tentative at first, polite, cautious, the kind of calls made by people who understood the emotional freight of a decades-old mystery. Some relatives were skeptical, others stunned, and a few were quietly cooperative, offering family stories, old photographs, and names that had never been shared with authorities. A faded passport photograph from a private album bore a resemblance that made the hair on the back of the investigator's neck stand up. With new names to test, the police reopened lines of inquiry that had long gone cold. Hotel registers were re-examined with fresh focus. Handwriting analysts compared signatures against family letters. Dental records were cross-checked with the family dentist's archives. Isotope analysis of the woman's hair and teeth, combined with the genealogical lead, suggested a childhood spent in a particular region of Europe and later years that included travel through northern ports. The composite picture remained incomplete, but it was suddenly coherent in ways it had never been before. The breakthrough also brought ethical and procedural complications. Contacting potential relatives required sensitivity and legal oversight. Investigators had to navigate privacy laws, the relative's right not to know, and the risk of false hope. Journalists smelled a story and circled, and the team had to manage public disclosure carefully to avoid contaminating witness testimony or jeopardizing ongoing inquiries. Social media amplified every hint, and amateur sleuths pored over the newly released details, sometimes producing helpful leads and sometimes muddying the waters with speculation. As the investigation deepened, new questions emerged. A name that matched the genealogical lead turned up in a travel ledger from the era, but the handwriting was ambiguous. A retired customs official remembered a woman who fit the description but could not place her nationality. A small, previously overlooked receipt suggested a purchase in a border town 2 weeks before the death. Each new fact opened doors and closed others, and the team learned to measure progress in degrees rather than in dramatic revelations. The emotional consequences were immediate and complex. For the relatives who engaged, the possibility of finally knowing what had happened to a long-absent family member brought relief and grief in equal measure. For investigators, the breakthrough was vindication of persistence and a reminder of the human stakes behind forensic data. For the public, the case shifted from an abstract mystery to a story about real people with names and histories. By the chapter's end, the breakthrough had not solved everything, but it had changed the terms of the inquiry. The Isdal woman was no longer only an image in a file. She had a likely lineage, a possible childhood landscape, and living connections who could help tell her story. The valley still held its silence, but elsewhere, in attics and archives and the careful work of living people, the pieces were beginning to click into place. The investigation moved forward with renewed purpose, aware that the final chapters might bring closure, contradiction, or both. The final months of the inquiry moved with a strange mixture of resolution and restraint. Investigators compiled reports that read like careful reconciliations. Forensic data aligned with family testimony, travel records fit into a plausible timeline, and the genealogical lead narrowed a field of possibilities into a handful of names. The Isdal woman was no longer only an image in a file. She had become a person whose life could be sketched in broader strokes. Origins in a particular European region, years of itinerant travel, and a pattern of deliberate anonymity that might have been chosen or imposed. Yet the case refused to be fully tamed by facts. Some questions closed, others opened into a deliberate silence. There were moments when the evidence itself seemed to insist on a gap, a place where records, memories, and material traces could not reach. Investigators learned to live with that absence as part of the truth. Not every life yields a tidy narrative, and not every death yields a motive that fits the neat categories of accident, suicide, or homicide. The lacuna became a feature of the story rather than a flaw, a space where imagination, grief, and the limits of inquiry met. That blank in the record had consequences. For relatives who had hoped for a single, definitive explanation, the lacuna was a wound reopened and then left to scar. For detectives and scientists, it was a professional humility, an acknowledgement that even the best methods have thresholds beyond which certainty dissolves. For the public, the gap preserved the case's power to haunt. It allowed the Isdal woman to remain both a subject of forensic scrutiny and a symbol of the many unnamed lives that passed through cities and valleys without leaving a full account. Procedurally, the investigation left a legacy. It changed how cold cases were handled in the region. Evidence preservation standards were tightened, interagency communication improved, and genealogical methods were integrated into missing person protocols. The case became a catalyst for institutional learning, a painful but productive lesson in how modern science and old records can be combined, and how they sometimes still fall short. The valley's silence prompted practical reforms that might help others whose stories begin with absence. Humanly, the outcome was quieter and more complicated. Some relatives accepted the partial answers and the lacuna as the best possible closure. They held a small, private ceremony and placed a name where there had been none. Others kept the files on a shelf, returning to them in fits of hope and doubt. The journalists who had followed the story for decades wrote final pieces that balanced revelation with restraint, honoring both the facts uncovered and the gaps that remained. The city of Bergen, which had once gossiped and speculated, settled into a steadier memory, a valley that held a life and a community that had tried, imperfectly, to answer for it. In the end, the Isdal woman's story resisted a single moral. It taught that persistence matters, that science can illuminate but not always complete, and that some human truths live in the spaces between evidence and imagination. The lacuna did not negate the work done. It complicated it, and in that complication, it preserved the dignity of a life that had been reduced to fragments for too long. The valley kept its hush, but elsewhere, among relatives, in police files, and in the careful pages of journalists, the woman's name, however newly found or tentatively assigned, was spoken with care.